Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our study this morning. We're going to continue with Ezekiel. We're going to be in chapter 47, which means next week we'll do chapter 48, and that's the end of the chapter. We started this on October 29th. Wow. We're nearing the end of September. So it's been an awesome study. We're not through yet, though. I've got one of the better ones today of all of them. You've heard me talk about a reversion to Eden-like conditions in the millennial kingdom. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We've got pretty much whole chapter on that topic today. So we're going to do that. But I want to show you, just to give you an idea as to the geographic information that is available today. I want you to understand what we're dealing with when we're talking about Jerusalem and where it is. We've got right here in the center is Jerusalem and Mount Moriah, and it's surrounded, and the elevation of that mountain is 2,438 feet. Up here, if I go the right way, up here is Mount Scopus, and over here is Mount of Olives. Hope I'm not doing this backwards. And over here is Mount Zion. Yeah, Mount Zion has 2,534 feet. Mount of Olives is 2,641 feet. And the Temple Mount is only 2,438 feet. Then flowing down right along here, down and on down this way, going the wrong way, is the Kidron Valley. Now that we're going to be talking about a flow of water today that's going to flow from the temple. And which way does water run? It runs downhill. Well, we're going to be on a 2,500 foot mountain. And so when water comes out of the temple, it's going to flow downhill. And it's as things are right now, it would follow the Kidron Valley down to the Dead Sea. But I want to show you another diagram. This shows you my great artwork, kind of artist that I am. It's got the same information on it. Mount Zion is right here. Temple Mount is right here. This shows a distance of 34 miles, the width of Israel. Right at that point, it's between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And then it's 24 miles from right there, which is on the banks of the Jordan River, down to the Dead Sea. Now, what's interesting about this is, there are many things interesting about this, but one thing that I have noted here is that from the Temple Mount, where the temple is or will be, the Jordan River falls, well, from there down to the Dead Sea is a total of 2,700 feet. It goes 2,500 feet to sea level, and then there's another 1,300 feet to get down to the Dead Sea, because the Dead Sea is below sea level. So we've got a massive change in elevation there in just a space of 24 miles between the Temple Mount, or the temple, down to the Dead Sea. Okay, I've got another chart for you right here, and this shows that this was professionally done. I want you to see right here is the temple complex right here. Yeah, that's the temple complex. Some other items you might be interested in is over here to this side is the Mount of Olives. You know, this would be the eastern gate. Here's the Mount of Olives. And Gethsemane, just if you want to know, is right here. Right here, there's the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus used to go to pray. And then the Kidron Valley goes down through there. That's the Jordan River somewhere along there. I'm pointing somewhere. I can't even see what I'm talking about. But the Kidron Valley, you know, this river we're going to talk about is going to flow out of the temple and it runs downhill. It's going to go down the Kidron Valley. Down here, the Dead Sea is not shown on here. But it's a very interesting thing about what is going to be taking place. Now, what I want you to realize, we're going to talk about it, is that this is the way the geography, the lay of the land is right now. But when Jesus returns, he's going to return to the Mount of Olives over here somewhere. And when he puts his feet down on the Mount of Olives, there's going to be a massive earthquake. And what happens to the land in earthquakes? It changes. Now, this is going to be a really big earthquake. We're going to read some of the scriptures out of Zechariah that talk about what's going to happen. But this Mount of Olives is going to move, splitting in two pieces, and it's going to move. So when I was pointing out to you the lay of the land and the downhill track that this river would take if there were no changes, then we see that this earthquake is going to most likely change the flow of water. So it's not going to be just necessarily flowing right down straight through the Kidron Valley, because this Mount of Olives is going to change, so everything else is going to change with it. Now, that earthquake is going to happen before the temple of Ezekiel 40 to 46, before it is built. So when it is built, and then the events of this flow of water begin to occur, then this is going to be affected. We know that most likely the water is going to be, there's going to be a lot of water. We're going to talk about that, but there's going to be an increase in fertility of the land, and it generally takes water for that fertility to occur. And so this, most likely this water, it's conjecture, but you'll see what I'm talking about when we get to it. This water is just going to be massive, and it's going to be there to create a change in the agriculture, a change in the farming, the fruits and the crops and all that are going to have more water, and they're just going to be booming when it comes to production. So the other thing I wanted to show you, you won't be able to see what's on this one, but right here, this is the aerial view of all that. Right here is Jerusalem. Over here is Jordan River, the country of Jordan. The Jordan River flows down through here. The Dead Sea is down here, and the Arabah is right here. Jerusalem is right here. So you can see how it is today. When that earthquakes occurred, the Jordan River probably isn't going to be flowing like it flows, because the ground is going to shift, and the water that it will be coming out of the new temple is not going to have the same, most likely is not going to have the same downward track that it has today, that it would have with the geography of today. Okay, so I just wanted you to see those things, and I want you to keep them in mind, so that when we go through these scriptures, you'll have something to think about. Maybe have something in your mind that'll help you get through what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to be in Ezekiel 47. I hope you're able to stay with me on that. My slides and my software didn't really work together. I was really having trouble with it today, so I had to just hold it up and hope that the camera was in focus when you were looking at it. But anyway, I want you to know that I believe the Bible is literal, and where possible, it should be interpreted as literal. Literal, not liberal, literal. And another thing I want you to consider is that just because some things may not seem to be literal, if they should be poetic, I'm guessing that, I'm not guessing, I'm feeling, and I wrote that in my book, that most likely they're going to be literal on some level, even if it's a poetic literal where we're talking about certain topics. But I believe that what we're talking about today should be interpreted literally. We're going to look at some Zechariah. He deals with some of it. John deals with some of it in Revelation, and so on and so forth. So let me quit talking outside of the Bible and let me get on into it. So let's go to verses 1 and 2 of chapter 47 of Ezekiel. Let me read verse 1. The man, and this is the guide that has been with us all through this, where he's taken Ezekiel around. The man brought me back to the entrance to the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple towards the east. For the temple faced east, we know that. And this is the new temple, let me tell you. There is no temple now. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. All right, so Ezekiel is at the entrance of the temple on the eastern side. That would be at the eastern gate, the east gate. And the threshold that's mentioned here may be the threshold of Ezekiel 46 verse 2, which means that this area we're talking about would be elevated because it'd be coming down steps. So at this point, the water is like a trickle, just a trickle. We're going to see that in verse 2. And it flowed out of the east. Think of those maps. The east was looking this way, and the Mount of Olives was over here. So the water came out of the east. It's just naturally going to turn south. So let's look at verse 2. He then brought me out through the north gate and led me around the outside of the outer gate facing east, and the water was trickling from the south side. So there's the word trickle in the NIV. It's not flowing at this point. It's a trickle. And this is just a different viewpoint that we have in verse 2 of the same thing that happened in verse 1. It's just a different angle of looking at it. I want to cover something with you on this flow of water. And this is an intriguing thought for me, and I've already mentioned it in the introduction to this, but we've already read of God's plan and prophecy. There are several statements in other verses that suggest there's going to be significant changes. I'll give you the scriptures. We're not going to go back and look at them. We've already covered them, but it's chapter 34, verses 26 to 30, chapter 36, verses 8 to 12, and 30 to 36, and chapter 37, verses 25 to 28. These all scriptures all suggest a change in the fertility of the land. They're talking about what I talked about the trees and the crops and just an increase in fertility. This flow of water will end up, it's going to flow. We're going to see in verse 8 that it's going to flow to the Dead Sea with amazing changes in fertility. You're going to see that if you're a fisherman, you're really going to like it, which we're going to see that in later in the chapter. With significant change in crop production then, there could also be a change in the flow of water to provide water to a larger land area. If you got water's confined to a ditch. It can't get out of the ditch unless you get some kind of flood. But when Jesus puts his foot down, we have this feet down, and when we have this big earthquake, you don't know what the land's going to do. So most likely, I'm thinking that it's going to be flowing all over everywhere, but it's going to flow. The majority of the flow is going to be directed in the direction of the Dead Sea. I want to look at Zechariah 14, verses 3 and 4. Yeah, right to it. How about that? Listen to this. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half of the mountain and half moving south. This day that it's talking about is the day of Armageddon, when the world is gathered to come against Jerusalem, and Jesus returns to put an end to it. And this is what's going to happen. We're going to have a giant earthquake. So particularly since it's such a large earthquake, and the water flow we're talking about is going to be right there when it occurs. This is happening before this water flow that I'm going to be talking about. So when the new temple is built, and this amazing life-giving water begins to flow, it may just be it may just have a new path to follow. Let's go back to Ezekiel 47. Let's look at verses 3 through 5. Let me read these. I'll read all three together. I want you to pay attention to this. This is in the millennial kingdom, the 1,000 years following the Great Tribulation and Armageddon and all that. So Jesus puts his foot down on the feet down on the second return, and he had this earthquake. And sometime after that, I believe the temple has to be built. And then some after the time of it, as it's built, what we're going to read here in chapter 47 is going to occur. All right, so let me read verses 3 through 5. As the man went eastward with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits, and then led me through water that was ankle deep. All right, that's where it starts. We had a trickle. Remember, we said the water was trickling out of the temple. And here we are, 1,000 cubits down the road there, down the side of the mountain, and we're ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits. In verse 4, he measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was knee deep. So now we've gone 2,000 cubits, and we're already up to our knees in water. He measured off another 1,000 and led me through water that was up to my waist. That's through verse 4. Then verse 5 says he measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river. We're not talking about a trickle, or just a creek flow. We're talking about river flow. It was a river that I could not cross because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in. A river that no one could cross. All right, so we started out with a trickle. Then we go a little ways, the water gets ankle deep. We go a little further, it gets knee deep. We go a little further, and it gets waist deep. And then it has become a river. Remember me telling you that Jerusalem, from the temple down to the Dead Sea, which is where this is going, we're going to look at here in just a minute. It's going to the Dead Sea. The elevation change is 3,800 feet. So water's going to start flowing pretty fast. So All right, so it gets to be a river that's deep enough too deep. It's deep enough to swim in, so it's got some depth to it, but it cannot be crossed. It says nobody can cross it, and that's all within a mile of the temple. There was hard to see how that could happen. I had a friend I used to work with. His name doesn't matter. His grandfather lived in Arkansas. He had a farm up there, and there was a creek that ran through it, or a river, I think is one of the rivers that ran through there. The land was basically flat. I mean, it looked flat. Tom told me that when it would rain, the whole area would flood. It would be hundreds of thousands of feet from the river. He said maybe a half a mile out there uh, of flooded land. And he said, you don't see how it could do it, but when the conditions are right, it just floods. Okay? So this is kind of, in your mind, you're thinking about what I'm telling you. When you got a trickle, sound like a plumbing leak up there in the temple. It's just such a small amount of water coming out of there. But it's not a plumbing leak. This is stuff that's flowing from the throne of God. But you're saying in your mind, how can that happen? We're talking about miraculous times here. All right. So keep in mind, which way does water flow? It's downhill. We've talked about that. The water is flowing downhill and still backing up. This is a flood of healing and life-giving water. You're going to see what I'm talking about when we get to it. The flow of Jesus' blood from Calvary became a fountain of redemption for all people who would believe. You could look and see that in Zechariah 13:1. We won't go look at it now, but you know what I'm talking about. Jesus' blood flows for forgiveness and healing. All right, verses 6 through 12 is talking about the flow of the river. Let's look at verses 6 through 8. He asked me, Son of man, do you see this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river. When I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. Verse 8, he said to me, this water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. This is what Ezekiel was told. Zechariah was told a little bit more, and John was told a little bit more in Revelation. The guide asked, do you see this? He's talking to Ezekiel, who's standing in water. He said, do you see this? I've got a little note here. Ezekiel says, duh. How could I not see it? I'm standing in it. But nevertheless, I'm just making a joke. But nevertheless, this is important. The guide is wanting to talk to Ezekiel about what's really going on here. And the reason I know that, it says he went back to the bank. So he had to be out there in the water somewhere or another. So let's look at verse 7. I think I read it. Verse 7, he sees a large number of trees on both sides of the river. And then he is told the water flows east, then to the south. It empties into the sea, and that sea is the Dead Sea. It has to be the Dead Sea. Mediterranean Sea is mentioned somewhere else. This is talking about a sea that's salty. It's talking about the Arabah. I think that was the only sea around there that had an Arabah, or an area called the Arabah. So nevertheless, we're sure we're talking about the Dead Sea. And the water in the sea, the Dead Sea is what? It is dead. Okay. It says that the water becomes fresh when it empties into the Dead Sea. What does that say about the water before it gets to the Dead Sea? The Dead Sea and the dead water of the Dead Sea becomes fresh. It does not mean the flowing water is salt water. It means the flowing water is full of life, and it has to be fresh water. So the Dead Sea apparently is going to fill up with fresh water, but there's more to it than that. It's going to become full of life. The King James says that this water is going to be is for healing. The water is going to be healed, and I'm saying that is so wonderful. We think of God as a provider of life. For us, he provides it through Jesus. Here, he's providing a dead area with life. He's using life-giving water to change everything in the area to Eden-like conditions. Actually, we're going to look at that in a second. It says it. And that dead water of the Dead Sea is going to be full of life. Verse 12 says, let me read verse 12. I'm jumping ahead, then I'm going to be jumping back. Verse 12 says, fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both sides of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Every month they will bear fruit because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food and their leaves for healing. Fruit trees on both sides of the river. Leaves will not wither. Fruit will not fail. In fact, it produces fruit every month. Why? Because the water used to keep the trees nourished comes from the sanctuary. It says it right there. The fruit is for food. The leaves are for healing. Now that is something we need to talk about. When you read the Bible, you need to be looking for things. You want to understand as much as you can before you leave an area. And this thing about the leaves being for healing is something that caught my eye. It caught my eye when I studied Revelation because it says the same thing there. But the word used for healing, Hebrew word, is rapha. It means heal or to heal. And Strong's Exhaustive Concordance uses words like cure, cause to heal, physician, repair, thoroughly make whole. Now, I like that, thoroughly make whole. You have to choose the word that you're using depending on the context that you're in. This is not the new heaven or the new Jerusalem that you read about in Revelation 22 or 21. This is the millennial kingdom. This is not the new heaven or the new Jerusalem where healing will already have occurred because there is no sin. Right now, there is still sin. But it says even in the new Jerusalem, the leaves are going to be for healing. So here, healing is not complete, and it is an ongoing process because sin is still in the world. We'll talk about, it's probably going to come up again in a minute, but the leaves are for health maintenance. It's for healing. It's going to keep people healthy. All right, this sounds like Edenic conditions, conditions like were present in Eden. Look at chapter 36, verse 35. Let me read that to you. They say this land that was laid waste has become like the Garden of Eden. That is what it's going to be like. So if it just sounds like this is utopia, if that's what you thought when you read about the Garden of Eden, that's what it's like. It is almost too good to be true, but it's promised. It's promised by God. So let's go way back to Genesis 3. Adam and Eve sinned. They were cursed. They were expelled from the garden. They had not eaten of the tree of life. They ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If they had eaten of the tree of life, they never would have died. The promise was, if you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. If they'd eaten of the other tree, they would live forever in a sinful state. All right, I just want to point that out to you. Now let's read Revelation 22, verse 1 through 4. While we're on the subject. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Okay, the elements there are water flowing from the throne of God. God is the provider of life. At least 2 trees of life were there. They bear fruit each month, and the leaves are for healing. There's no curse of death. There's no temple, and there's no night. In Ezekiel, the account of the flow of water from the sanctuary is east to the south down to the Arabah of the Dead Sea. The Arabah of the Dead Sea is at the south end of the Dead Sea. And everything it touches is rejuvenated from life-giving water. This water in Ezekiel is going into a dead area. It's going to the Dead Sea. We've talked about that. Everybody knows about the Dead Sea. Nothing will grow. Nothing will live in there. The water continues southward to the Dead Sea, which itself even becomes full of life. The Dead Sea, now these numbers can change. At the time I wrote these notes, this is what my source said. The Dead Sea is 26% mineral compared with seawater, which is only 4 to 6%. So you can't drink seawater. If you can't drink seawater, you really can't drink water from the Dead Sea. It's worse. A friend of mine, one of my old pastors, said that floating, when he was traveling over there, said floating in the Dead Sea is a much more buoyant than seawater even. Okay, but here the water of the Dead Sea becomes fresh. This water is going to flow from the temple to the Dead Sea, and it's going to rejuvenate. It's going to put life into everything. The barren becomes fruitful, dry becomes nourished, empty becomes filled, bitter becomes sweet, unhealthy becomes healed, and dead is made alive. Wow. Let me read verse 12 again. Verse 12 says, fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. Their leaves, this is back in the millennial kingdom, their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food, and their leaves for healing. What is there to be healed? This is not heaven. You know, we think of heaven as being no sickness, no sadness, no death. All of those things are present in the millennial kingdom. The nations are still present. we had the armies that were slaughtered at Armageddon, but all those guys slaughtered at Armageddon left families at home. Their wives were still there. Their children were still there. Sin was still there. If those people are still there, the Gentiles are left there, and they were all left in their sin. Satan was locked up for 1,000 years, but sin is still present. The trees here are not called the tree of life, yet they provide for life. They provide for healing, refurbishing, and maintaining life. That's what health is for. If you're sick and you're getting healed, your life is being maintained. It's being refurbished. Does anybody die there? Not one person who was dead and resurrected at the rapture will ever die again. So those guys are not going to die. But there is no mention of death, but we know death is still present because sin is still present. Okay, now let's look at the elements of Revelation 22, 1 through 4. I just read it. It's the New Jerusalem, the tree of life. It had leaves for healing. So if there's no sickness and no death in heaven, what are the leaves for? What kind of things need to be healed? This is something that bothered me. I couldn't find a commentary that would help me with the answer. I asked a table full of seminary students one time, what does that mean? Not one of them could answer me, and not one of them tried to answer it to get back to me with an answer except one. It's a good friend of mine. He called me up. I told him that I found the answer that was suitable for my understanding from Jack Van Impe in one of his books, and he said it's like health maintenance. It keeps you healthy. That's going to be the same in heaven, and it's going to be the same in the millennial kingdom. It's health maintenance. Okay, so let's move on. Verses 9 through 11. We've been all around these. We hadn't read them yet, but verses 9 through 11 say this. Okay, I just read in verse 8, when it empties into the Dead Sea, the salty water there becomes fresh. What a day to be a fisherman. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There will be a large numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. This is water coming from the temple. It is coming from the throne of God. Fishermen, in verse 10, fishermen will stand along the shore from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. There will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. So when we talked about the sea up there, it can't be the Mediterranean Sea because this is talking about a sea that will become like the Mediterranean Sea regarding the life that's in it. And then verse 11 says, but the swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt. So we don't want to wipe out all of our sources of salt, so they'll still be there in the marshy areas. All right, it's pretty clear. Life is everywhere. The once dead sea teems with fish, all sizes. If I were fishing, I would catch the small ones, if I caught any at all. These other fishermen are reeling in the big ones. The water descended from 2,400 feet at Jerusalem, plus another 1,290 feet to get to the Dead Sea. That's a drop of 3,700 feet. So this water's got to be moving when it gets down to the bottom. The caustic mineral waters of the Dead Sea become living waters for all kinds of life. The comparison of a variety of fish is made to that, to the Mediterranean Sea. Here it's called the Great Sea in some translations. but it was the Mediterranean that was used in comparison. There is a difference here to that of the New Jerusalem of Revelation 22. I'm going to cover it, and then we'll move on. This is earth, the old earth, the present earth, the earth we currently live on. The new heaven and the new earth and the new Jerusalem come down when the old heaven and the old earth have passed away. That's talked about in 2 Peter 3, verses 10 through 13. Let me read it. 2 Peter 2 Peter 3, verses 10 through 13. Listen as I read. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. Verse 11, since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives. Verse 12, as you look forward to the day of God and the speed of its coming. That day will bring about the destruction of the heavens by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. Then verse 13, but in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. You believe it? The Bible says it. You can't picture it. It's almost impossible to imagine. But when it happens, you're going to recognize it. Many people want to spiritualize everything in the Bible, to take away the literalness of it and say, we're going to interpret this spiritually. Well, if you do that, you don't really have a lot of Word of God left. You're taking it and changing it into what you think it ought to be. Many times when people spiritualize things or interpret them in a non-literal manner, they do it because they don't want to take the reality of the literalness of it. What did Jesus say about hell? Hell's a good example. People don't want to think that a good God that claims to love people would send them to an eternity of suffering. Jesus said he will do exactly that under certain conditions. He says that in Matthew 25, verse 41 and 46. I'm going to read it here. I wasn't going to do that, but I think it's a good idea for me to go ahead and read it since we're on the subject. Matthew 25, verses 41 and 46. 25:41. Then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. That's what Jesus said. 46. Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. Well, many times what happens is we don't want to, not we, I take it like it says it. They want to say God just won't do the bad. He's not going to really punish people because I've lived a good life. Well, by comparison to the righteousness of God, you hadn't lived a very good life. They want the good, but they don't want the bad. The Bible is clear on certain topics, and I don't think that spiritualizing everything is a very good idea. It needs to be taken literally on some level, probably every single thing that's in the Bible. Okay. We've got a few more verses, then we'll be through. It's about boundaries of the land. You knew we're going to get the land. The land is important to the Jew. It's important to everybody. But let's just look at this. Verses 13 and 14, chapter 47 of Ezekiel. This is what the sovereign Lord says. These are the boundaries of the land that you will divide among the 12 tribes of Israel as their inheritance. We're talking about the promised land now. You're finally going to get it. You are to divide it equally among them. It said with two portions to Joseph. You remember, I think it was, I'm not sure which one it was, either Levites or it was Dan was taken out of the inheritance, and Joseph got a double portion. And what happened was Jacob adopted the two sons that Joseph had while he was in Egypt. After he'd been sold into slavery and all that by his brothers, he ended up in Egypt, and then he protected his family when the famine came. Well, he got a double portion. Okay. In verse 14, you are to divide it equally among them, because I swore with uplifted hand to give it to your ancestors. This land will become your inheritance. God will divide the land himself personally. In contrast to the allotments made by Joshua in Joshua 14 verses 1 through 5. So we're not going to read that, but this is going to be a fair allotment among the tribes. Allotments will be the original tribe names, except that Joseph will get a double portion. Okay. Verse 14, allotments will be made in partial fulfillment of the promise God made with Abraham in Genesis 12, 1 through 3, 15, 7 through 21, and 17, 1 through 14. With the double portion to Joseph. The tribal allotments will be equal in size. Okay, 15 to 20. Let me just read through all of that and see if I have a comment as we go. I don't think that I do necessarily, but it's got the allotments of the whole land. It talks about the boundary of the land, okay? So starting with 15, it says this is to be the boundary of the land. On the north side, it will run from the Mediterranean Sea by the Hethlon Road past Lebo Hamath and Zedad, Berotha, and Sebraim, which lies on the border between Damascus and Hamath, as far as Hazar Hadakon, which is on the border of Haran. The boundary, you see, while we're not going to talk much about this, the boundary, because I don't know where any of this stuff is, the boundary will extend from the Sea of Hazran Enan along the northern border of Damascus with the border of Hamath to the north. This will be the northern boundary. On the east side, in verse 18, on the east side, the boundary will run between Haran and Damascus along the Jordan, between Gilead and the land of Israel to the Dead Sea, and as far as Tamar. This will be the eastern boundary. And on the south, in verse 19 and on into 20, on the south side it will run from Tamar as far as the waters of the Meribah, Kadesh, then along the Wadi of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. This will be the southern boundary. Verse 20, on the west side, the Mediterranean Sea will be the boundary to a point opposite Lebo Hamath. This will be the western boundary. I have no comment. Those are just the boundaries. I don't know where that stuff is. But the important thing is to know God laid out the promised land, and they're going to get it. All right, verse 21 to 23 is about the equitable allocation of the land. Let me read it. 21 to 23. You are to distribute this land among yourselves according to the tribes of Israel. You are to allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the foreigners residing among you. That is important. And for the foreigners residing among you and who have children. And for the foreigners residing among you and who have children. You are to consider them as native-born Israelites. Along with you, they are to be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. In whatever tribe a foreigner resides, there you are to give them their inheritance, declares the sovereign Lord. All right. Again, the distribution is to be equal rather than as like Joshua did it back in Joshua 14, 1 through 5. And to be honest with you, I did not go back and read that. I've read it before. These new boundaries suggest a new kingdom will preserve the laws of equity which discriminated against the proselyte Jew in the past. Now, I want to go back in your mind. I want you to go back to Deuteronomy, where Moses told the people that God told the people through Moses that aliens, they were called aliens in the NIV, but what those people are were non-Jews. Those non-Jews, aliens, could live among the people as long as they kept Jewish law. As long as they lived by the people, the law of the land was Jewish. Live by those laws and you can live with us. Apparently, some of that was not considered in a fair way, according to the way God considers fair when Joshua was allocating things. But now that's going to be taken into consideration. I had a comment here. It said that this new land and way of allocating it could be a model for justice and righteousness. Well, nevertheless, that's the end of chapter 47. That first part of that, I've told you many times in our study of Ezekiel that it's going to revert to Eden-like conditions. And there it is right there, with the flow of water that starts with a trickle from the throne of God. And it's reiterated again in Revelation, but it's two different things. God showed Ezekiel this for the millennial kingdom. He showed John the new heaven and new earth, New Jerusalem, and how it's going to be. They're similar, identical in some ways, but John doesn't borrow from Ezekiel. He doesn't plagiarize, he doesn't copy. He gets inspired word from God in his vision of the new heaven and the new earth and the New Jerusalem. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for studying. Oh, one more thing. Next week we're going to study chapter 48. And that will be a wrap on Ezekiel. Thank you for studying with me. See you next time.